If you've ever believed that Europe's transition from medieval faith to modern reason was simply the natural result of human progress, that belief needs revision. History rarely moves in straight, organic lines. What we call intellectual evolution is often the outcome of pressure, conflict, incentive, and coordination. The rise of reason in the West was not a spontaneous awakening. It was the product of long-term structural change, guided by actors who understood that ideas are tools, and tools reshape power. Medieval Europe functioned under a unified epistemology. Truth came from divine authority, interpreted through religious institutions. Knowledge was not something individuals discovered independently, it was something they received. Education operated within narrow boundaries. Questioning doctrine was not framed as curiosity, but as destabilization. This system created cohesion, but it also limited adaptability. As Europe's economic structure began to change, this rigidity became a liability. Trade routes expanded, urban centers grew, merchant classes accumulated wealth outside feudal hierarchies. Banking families emerged with influence that did not rely on noble lineage or religious rank. These new power holders required flexibility, calculation, and predictability. Faith-based authority was not designed to manage contracts, interest, navigation, or large-scale logistics. This mismatch created friction, not opposition yet, but pressure. The existing worldview could not efficiently process the complexity of the new economic reality. Practical problem-solving began to matter more than theological consistency. Mathematics, astronomy, engineering, and law gained silent priority over metaphysics. The Renaissance did not begin as a cultural movement for the masses. It began as an elite project. Wealthy patrons funded scholars not out of rebellion, but utility. Recovering classical knowledge offered strategic advantages. Roman law, Greek mathematics, and empirical observation had value because they worked. They produced results independent of religious interpretation. Importantly, these ideas were not initially framed as replacements for faith. They were framed as supplements. This framing was deliberate. Challenging religious authority directly would have triggered suppression. So reason was introduced tactically as a tool for refinement rather than disruption. Intellectual exchange occurred through correspondence networks that crossed political boundaries. Scholars communicated privately, sharing observations and experiments cautiously. These were not revolutionary manifestos. They were quiet iterations. What works? What fails? What can be repeated? Knowledge became something verified by consistency, not revelation. The invention of the printing press amplified this shift, but again, not democratically. Early printing was monitored, censored, and limited to approved circles. What spread initially were sanitized versions of new ideas, texts that normalized rational inquiry without openly attacking belief. This gradual exposure mattered. It trained minds to accept a new standard of truth. Over time, intellectual communities became more coordinated. Scientific societies, philosophical circles, and academic institutions formed. Their public mission was learning. Their structural function was legitimacy. Once rational inquiry had formal institutions, it could reproduce itself. Authority began migrating from sacred hierarchy to credentialed expertise. This transition accelerated during the scientific revolution. Experimental methods challenged inherited knowledge. Observation contradicted scripture in measurable ways. The question was no longer whether faith was true, but whether it was necessary for understanding reality. Once prediction and replication worked without theological input, faith lost monopoly over explanation. Political institutions noticed. Centralized governments needed tools for taxation, administration, and population control. Rational systems promised efficiency. Enlightenment philosophy reframed society as a machine rather than a mystery. If governed by laws, it could be optimized. Philosophers of this era were not isolated thinkers. Many were embedded within state systems, courts, or universities funded by power. Their ideas justified new forms of authority: the social contract, legal equality, secular law. These concepts reduced dependency on religious legitimacy and increased dependency on institutional systems. Religion was not eliminated, it was repositioned. It became private, symbolic, and moral, rather than organizational. This shift was subtle, but decisive. Once belief was internalized, institutions could operate independently of it. By redefining reason as universal and faith as subjective, Western society created a hierarchy of credibility. What could be measured gained priority. What could not was tolerated, but sidelined. Education systems trained this distinction. Children learned how to think before why to believe. This restructuring produced immense benefits. Science advanced rapidly. Living standards improved. Political rights expanded. But the same rational frameworks also introduced obstruction. Humans were increasingly treated as data points, economic units, or social variables. Meaning became optional. By the 19th century, the transition was complete. Western power no longer derived its authority from divine sanction, but from procedural legitimacy. Systems governed behavior. Bureaucracy replaced ritual. Expertise replaced priesthood. Yet something important remained hidden. Reason itself had become an ideology. It claimed neutrality, but served specific functions. It favored controllability over transcendence, efficiency over existential depth. This was not accidental. Systems that scale require predictability. When reason dominates, questions that cannot be operationalized lose influence. Questions of purpose, suffering, and meaning persist, but without structural support. Individuals are left to resolve them alone. This creates a subtle psychological cost: freedom paired with isolation. Modern Western society often congratulates itself on having escaped illusion, but it has merely traded one framework of authority for another. Faith once explained the world from above. Reason now explains it from within systems that no one individual controls. Understanding the rise of reason as a managed transition rather than a miracle of enlightenment changes how we view modern power. Ideas do not rise simply because they are true. They rise because they align with structures capable of enforcing them. The same forces that elevated reason continue to operate today. Narratives that integrate smoothly into economic, technological, and political systems gain dominance. Others fade, regardless of their depth. The Western shift from faith to reason was not just an intellectual event. It was a civilizational redesign. And like every redesign, it solved certain problems while quietly creating new ones. We live inside the outcome of that process. Most of us never question how it began.